He had billions, but watching her feed his son taught him real wealth. Ethan Caldwell was a billionaire by 45. Private jets, oceanfront mansions, power that bent boardrooms to his will. Yet none of it mattered when it came to his son, Leo. Leo was 8 years old and lived with cerebral palsy. His body didn't respond the way his mind wanted it to. Simple tasks, holding a spoon, swallowing food, sitting upright, required patience Ethan didn't realize he no longer had. Ethan loved his son deeply, but grief had hardened him. Every meal felt like a reminder of what Leo couldn't do. He hired nurses, therapists, specialists, but he rarely stayed in the room. One evening, running late from a meeting, Ethan stopped at a quiet roadside diner. He carried Leo inside, already tense, already exhausted. That was when he saw her. Her name tag read Maya, the black letters slightly worn as if they had seen years of quiet service, and she wore it over a neatly pressed uniform that matched the calm in her eyes. She was a young black waitress with a voice that didn't hurry and a presence that didn't demand attention, the kind of person who noticed things without making a show of noticing them. When she approached the table, she saw Leo's rigid posture, the way his hands trembled as Ethan tried to help him sit comfortably, and she understood immediately what others often misunderstood. She didn't stare, and she didn't turn away either, but instead met the moment with a soft, human steadiness that felt rare in a world always rushing to the next task. "Would you like help feeding him?" She asked gently, not assuming, not pitying, just offering, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Ethan paused, his hand tightening slightly around the napkin he'd been folding and unfolding out of habit, because he was used to trained therapists, certified nurses, and carefully scheduled routines, not strangers in restaurants, and certainly not waitresses who carried trays and took orders. Before he could respond, Leo let out a small, frustrated sound, sharp with effort, and his spoon slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor, the sound echoing louder than it should have felt in the quiet dining room. Ethan flinched instinctively, bracing for the familiar looks of discomfort or impatience from nearby tables, but Maya was already kneeling down, unbothered, unhurried, picking up the spoon as if it were no inconvenience at all. She wiped it carefully, checked it with a thoughtful glance, and then smiled at Leo in a way that didn't rush him to smile back, a smile that seemed to say there was nowhere else she needed to be and nothing more important than this moment. She spoke to him softly, explaining each small step as if he were fully in control of the pace, asking permission with her eyes before bringing the spoon closer, waiting until his breathing settled, waiting until his mouth relaxed, waiting until he was ready. She fed him slowly, pausing after every bite, watching his throat, reading his expressions, adjusting without being told, encouraging him with quiet words and warm patience, never forcing, never sighing, never checking the room or the clock. When he struggled, she didn't correct him. When he succeeded, she celebrated it with a gentle laugh and a proud nod, as if he had just achieved something extraordinary, because to her he had. Each swallow became a victory, each bite a shared effort, and slowly the tension that usually wrapped itself around meals like an invisible rope began to loosen. Leo's shoulders softened, his hands stopped shaking so hard, and then unexpectedly a small sound escaped him, not frustration this time but laughter, light and surprised, the kind that came from feeling safe. It was the first time he had laughed during a meal, and it stopped Ethan's breath mid-inhale. Ethan sat across the table frozen, watching a stranger do what money, resources, and endless appointments had never quite achieved, his chest tightening as realization washed over him. He saw the way Maya treated his son not as a problem to manage or a task to complete, but as a person worthy of time, and in that moment, something shifted inside him. He had spent years believing the world would never slow down enough for Leo, yet here was proof that sometimes it wasn't about expertise or titles, but about patience and presence. No one had ever fed his son like that, with such calm respect, such quiet dignity, and as Ethan watched Leo smile up at Maya with trust in his eyes, he felt a mixture of gratitude and guilt, wondering how many moments he himself had rushed through without meaning to. The room around them seemed to fade. the clink of dishes and murmur of conversation dissolving into the background, leaving only the image of a waitress kneeling beside his son, unhurried, fully present, changing something far deeper than a single meal without ever realizing just how much she had already begun to transform his understanding of care, humanity, and what it truly meant to see someone. Minutes passed, then more minutes piled quietly on top of them until time itself seemed to loosen its grip on the room. The restaurant continued to live its ordinary life around them. Plates clinked, chairs shifted, voices rose and fell. But at their table the world moved differently. The food had gone cold, steam long vanished, sauces settling into stillness, yet Leo had finished every bite. Every slow, deliberate swallow felt like a small miracle, not because it was rare for him to eat, but because it had happened without struggle, without tension, without the familiar knot of anxiety tightening Ethan's chest. Maya never checked the clock hanging near the kitchen door, never glanced toward another table, never let out even the smallest sigh of impatience. Her movement stayed gentle and steady, as if time belonged to her and she was choosing to spend it here. Ethan watched her hands, the careful rhythm she kept, the way she adjusted when Leo needed more time, and with every passing second, something inside him began to crack, not loudly, not all at once, but with the quiet sound of a wall giving way after years of pressure. He felt memories rise uninvited, rushed breakfasts before meetings, dinners cut short by phone calls, moments when he had handed responsibility to someone else because it was easier, cleaner, more efficient. He realized how often he rushed not just meals, but moments, how often he avoided sitting through the hard parts because they reminded him of everything he couldn't fix. He saw clearly now how he had replaced presence with money, convincing himself that providing the best doctors, the best equipment, the best care was the same as being there fully, when in truth it had been a shield he hid behind. As Maya finally stood to leave, wiping her hands and straightening her uniform, Ethan felt panic rise at the thought of the moment ending, of this quiet lesson slipping away unspoken. "How do you know how to do that?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended, thick with something he didn't have a name for yet. She paused, then smiled, not brightly, not proudly, but with a softness edged by sadness, the kind of smile that carries history. "My brother has cerebral palsy," she said gently. "He passed away last year. Feeding him was our quiet time." The words landed heavier than any accusation could have. Ethan couldn't speak. His throat closed and his carefully controlled world tilted, forcing him to confront a truth he had avoided for years. He thought of all the quiet times he had missed, all the chances to slow down and simply be with his son, not as a problem to manage, but as a person to share space with. For the first time in years, shame settled over him, not the corrosive kind that blamed his son or the world, but a clear, painful awareness of his own absence. And in that shame was something else too, fragile but unmistakable, the beginning of change. The cafe smelled of burnt espresso and cinnamon that morning, the same as every morning. Maya wiped the counter in slow, practiced arcs, her shoulders already heavy from a night spent listening to Leo's uneven breathing through the baby monitor. She hadn't slept more than 3 consecutive hours in weeks, not since the new medication had started giving him strange twitches instead of calm. The bell above the door chimed at 7:42 a.m., too early for the usual crowd. She looked up expecting one of the delivery guys. Instead, Ethan Caldwell stood there again. No tailored suit today, just dark jeans, a plain gray hoodie, and eyes that looked like they hadn't closed since he'd left the night before. He carried no briefcase, no phone in his hand, just a small paper bag that smelled faintly of fresh bread. Maya froze, cloth still dripping onto the tiles. "You're back," she said flatly. It wasn't a question. "I couldn't sleep." His voice cracked on the last word. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about Leo, about how I looked at him like a problem to solve instead of my son." She set the cloth down, crossed her arms. "Most people send an email when they have an epiphany, or a check. You already left enough on the table last night to cover my rent for 3 months." "I know." He stepped closer, lowering his voice even though the cafe was empty except for old Mr. Delgado dozing in the corner booth. The money didn't fix anything. It just made me feel less guilty for about 20 minutes. Then I sat in my penthouse staring at the city lights and realized I have no idea how to be a father to him. Not really. Not the way he needs. Maya studied him. The billionaire who could buy entire hospital wings looked small, lost. For the first time she saw the faint tremor in his hands. "What do you want, Ethan?" He exhaled like he'd been holding the breath for hours. "I want you to teach me. Show me how to feed him without rushing. How to hold the spoon so he doesn't choke. How to wait when he needs 30 seconds just to swallow. How to sit in silence with him and not check my email every 10 seconds. How to be there, actually there." She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the request was so absurdly simple and so impossibly huge at the same time. "You want lessons from a barista who can barely keep the lights on." "I want lessons from the only person I've seen who looks at my son like he's whole, not broken, not expensive, just Leo." The words landed heavier than any tip he'd ever left. She glanced toward the back hallway where Leo's stroller was parked beside the storage room. He was still asleep, head tilted against the padded side, one small hand curled near his cheek. A thin line of drool glistened on his chin. Beautiful in the way only sleeping children can be, peaceful, unguarded. Maya turned back to Ethan. "This isn't a one-time thing. If I say yes, you show up, every day. No excuses about board meetings or transatlantic calls. You show up dirty from the subway if you have to. You show up tired. You show up human." "I will." She searched his face for the lie, found only fear and something fiercer underneath it. Determination, maybe, or desperation. "Fine," she said quietly, "but we start now, and you're buying the coffee." He almost smiled, almost. They moved to the small table near the window. Maya wheeled Leo over. The boy stirred, eyes fluttering open, unfocused at first, then landing on his father. No recognition, not really, but no fear either, just curiosity. Ethan swallowed hard. Maya lifted the small container of pureed pear she'd prepared earlier. First rule, never rush the bite. Never assume he's ready just because you are. Watch his mouth. Watch his tongue. If he turns away, you wait. You don't force. You don't bribe. You just exist with him. She demonstrated slow scoop, gentle approach, pause when Leo's lips parted only halfway. A tiny tremor ran through his jaw. She waited. 10 seconds, 15. Then he accepted the bite, messy and slow. Ethan watched like a man memorizing scripture. "Your turn," she said, sliding the container across. His hand shook as he took the spoon. The first attempt was too fast. Leo coughed, pear dripping down his chin. Ethan flinched like he'd been slapped. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize to me," Maya said softly. "Apologize to him. Look him in the eye and mean it." Ethan leaned down. "I'm sorry, Leo, I rushed you. I'll go slower, I promise." Leo blinked. A small wet sound escaped his throat, almost a laugh, almost a sigh. They continued like that for 40 minutes, spoon by spoon, pause by pause. Ethan's phone buzzed twice in his pocket. He never reached for it. When the container was finally empty, Leo's eyes were drooping again. Maya wiped his face with a warm cloth, humming the same tuneless lullaby she always used. Ethan watched every movement like he was learning a foreign language. "Thank you," he whispered when she finished. "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "This was one feeding. You've got years of them ahead." "I know." He looked at her then, really looked. "I've spent my whole life thinking time was the most valuable currency. Turns out I was wrong. Attention is. And I've been bankrupt for a long time." Maya didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. Weeks slipped by in a rhythm neither of them expected. Ethan arrived every morning at 7:30 sharp, sometimes in the hoodie, sometimes still wearing yesterday's shirt because he'd been up all night reading about cerebral palsy, AAC devices, sensory integration, and the long-term outcomes of children like Leo. He asked questions, hundreds of them. Maya answered the ones she could. For the ones she couldn't, she pointed him to real therapists, support groups, online forums run by parents who'd walked this road for decades. He listened. He learned to read Leo's microexpressions, the slight tightening around the eyes that meant discomfort, the soft exhale that meant contentment. He learned to position the wheelchair correctly so Leo's hips didn't slide. He learned the exact pressure Leo liked on his palms during hand massage. He learned that silence wasn't failure. Sometimes it was the most honest form of presence. Meanwhile, the boardroom began to fracture. Emails piled up. Missed meetings multiplied. The CFO sent increasingly terse messages. The VP of Strategy scheduled an intervention lunch that Ethan never attended. On the 23rd day, Ethan walked into the gleaming headquarters of Caldwell Ventures on the 62nd floor and did the thing no one thought he ever would. He resigned from daily operations. Not the company, not his shares, but the helm. He appointed his COO, quiet, competent Priya, as interim CEO with full decision-making authority. He kept a single seat on the board for major votes, nothing more. The room went deathly silent when he finished speaking. One of the older partners finally asked, voice thin, "Is this about your son?" Ethan looked around the glass table at faces he'd known for 15 years. "It's about everything I pretended didn't matter while I was chasing numbers that never stopped growing." He left the building at 3:17 p.m. without bodyguards, without fanfare. Just a man in a hoodie carrying a canvas tote filled with adaptive spoons, sensory toys, and a dog-eared copy of The Out of Sync Child. That same evening, he sat across from Maya at the tiny kitchen table in her rent-controlled apartment. Leo was asleep in the next room. The overhead light flickered. "I'm starting a foundation," Ethan said without preamble. "Not another vanity project with photo ops and galas. Something real. Funding in-home nursing so parents don't have to choose between work and caregiving. Training programs for aides who actually understand nonverbal communication. Respite grants so families can breathe for a weekend. Equipment that insurance won't cover. Scholarships for siblings who get forgotten." Maya set her mug down slowly. "And you're telling me this because I want you to run it." She laughed, a short, startled sound. "I serve coffee, Ethan. I wipe tables. I change diapers and crush pills into applesauce. I'm not a nonprofit executive." "You're already doing the hardest part," he said. "You show up every single day for a child the world calls severe. You make him feel safe, loved, seen. That's the only qualification that matters. The rest, budgets, grants, hearing, I'll help with, or we'll hire people who know how. But the heart of it, that has to be you." She stared at him for a long time. Outside, a car horn blared. Somewhere upstairs, a baby cried. "I'll think about it," she said finally. But they both knew she'd already decided. 3 months later, the Leo Caldwell Foundation opened its first office, not in a glass tower, but in a converted ground-floor space 2 blocks from the cafe. Bright walls, soft lighting, a sensory room for children who needed quiet, a corner with a coffee machine that Maya still used every morning. On the opening day, Ethan stood at the back of the small crowd while Maya cut the ribbon, actually just a length of blue yarn because she thought it was more honest. Lee sat in his chair beside her, wearing a tiny tie Maya had found at a thrift store. He waved one hand in slow, joyful arcs. Reporters asked Ethan for comments. He shook his head. "Talk to her," he said. "She's the one who changed everything." Later, when the crowd had thinned and the sunlight slanted golden through the windows, Maya found Ethan sitting on the floor with Leo. The boy's head rested against his father's chest. Ethan's fingers moved in gentle circles over Leo's back, the same rhythm Maya had taught him months earlier. He looked up when she approached. "You okay?" she asked. Ethan smiled, small, tired, real. "For the first time in years," he said, "I think I am." And in that quiet room, with the sound of Leo's soft breathing between them, two people who had once been strangers chose something far more expensive than money. They chose time. They chose presence. They chose each other's broken, beautiful, ordinary humanity. And everything changed. The penthouse had changed. Gone were the sterile white walls and minimalist Italian furniture that once screamed control. In their place, warm cedar shelves lined with board books nobody had ever opened before, a low table scarred from years of use, and a bright red therapy mat spread across the living room floor like an island of color in what used to be an ocean of gray. It was 7:14 p.m. on a Tuesday in late autumn. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered like it always did, restless, brilliant, indifferent. Inside, the only light came from the small lamp on the side table and the soft glow of the string lights Maya had insisted Ethan hang because Leo likes to watch them move. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor. Leo sat in the supportive corner chair they'd bought secondhand from another family who understood exactly what supportive really meant. The boy's head tilted slightly to the left, the way it always did when he was tired but content. A navy bib hung around his neck, already speckled with sweet potato and yogurt. Ethan held the small, shallow bowl in one hand. In the other, the familiar maroon spoon, the one with the built-up handle that made it easier to grip even when your fingers were trembling from nerves or exhaustion. He scooped a tiny amount. "Ready, buddy." Leo's eyes tracked the spoon, not perfectly but enough to matter. Ethan moved slowly, agonizingly slowly compared to the man he used to be. No phone on the table, no smartwatch buzzing alerts, no assistant hovering in the hallway with another urgent message from Priya or the board. Just the spoon, just the boy, just the moment. He brought the spoon to Leo's mouth at an angle he'd practiced 100 times now. Leo opened, slow, deliberate, the tiny muscles working in sequence the way the neurologist had described in their last Zoom call. The bite went in. A small dribble escaped immediately, orange against Leo's chin. Ethan didn't wipe it away instantly. He waited. He watched. Leo's tongue moved, searching, adjusting. A soft, wet sound, then finally a swallow, small but complete. Ethan exhaled like he'd been holding oxygen for years. "Good job," he whispered, not because Leo could answer, not because anyone was watching, just because the words felt true. He scooped again. This time Leo smiled, really smiled. Not the reflex grimace he sometimes made when overstimulated, but the real one, corners of the mouth lifting, eyes crinkling, a small burst of sound that lived somewhere between a giggle and a sigh. A blob of sweet potato slid down Leo's chin and landed on the bib with an audible plop. Ethan laughed. It wasn't the sharp, victorious bark he used to give after closing a 9-figure deal. It wasn't performative. It was quiet, surprised, almost startled, as though his own body had forgotten it still knew how to make that sound without agenda. The laugh bubbled up again when Leo reached out with his left hand, his good hand, and patted Ethan's wrist. Not coordinated, not purposeful, just contact, skin to skin, warmth acknowledging warmth. Ethan set the bowl down for a second. He covered Leo's small hand with his own, let the moment stretch. "You're ridiculous," he murmured. "You know that, covered in vegetables and still the best thing in the room." Leo made another soft noise. His fingers flexed once against Ethan's palm. Outside, a helicopter thumped past, low and loud. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't check the time. He didn't calculate how many millions the delay on tomorrow's Asia call might cost. He just stayed. When the bowl was finally empty, 28 minutes later, Ethan wiped Leo's face with the warm cloth he kept in the warmer on the counter. He did it in slow circles the way Maya had shown him, humming the same tuneless melody she always used. Leo's eyelids grew heavy. His breathing deepened into the slow, even rhythm that meant sleep was close. Ethan lifted him carefully, cradling the back of his head, supporting the hips the way the physical therapist had drilled into him, and carried him to the bedroom that used to be a guest suite. Now it was Leo's, sky-blue walls, a mobile of soft stars turning lazily above the bed, a framed photo on the dresser, Maya, Ethan, and Leo at the boardwalk last month, wind in their hair, Leo laughing at nothing in particular. He laid Leo down, tucked the weighted blanket just right, kissed his forehead. "Love you, kid," he said quietly, "more than anything on any spreadsheet." Leo's eyes were already closed. Ethan stood there anyway, watching the rise and fall of that small chest, listening to the soft rasp of breath, counting the seconds between each inhale until he lost track. Eventually, he walked back to the living room. The city lights kept burning, the same view he'd stared at for years while negotiating term sheets at 3 a.m., convinced that more was the only direction worth moving in. He sank onto the couch, still in the same hoodie he'd worn to the cafe that morning, and picked up the small ceramic mug Maya had left earlier. Chamomile, gone cold. He drank it anyway. His phone sat face down on the coffee table. He hadn't touched it since 6 p.m. He didn't reach for it now. Instead, he thought about the afternoon he'd spent at the foundation office. Maya had been on the phone with a mother in Buffalo whose insurance had denied a communication device for her nonverbal daughter. Maya hadn't raised her voice, hadn't promised miracles. She just listened. Then she'd said, "We'll figure it out. You're not alone in this." Ethan had watched from the doorway, feeling something dangerously close to awe. He'd built skyscrapers, acquired companies, moved markets with a signature. But he had never made anyone feel less alone the way Maya did every single day. And somehow, impossibly, that quiet certainty had started to feel like the real currency. He leaned his head back against the cushion. Wealth, he thought. He used to think it was the number followed by too many zeros. The private jet. The ability to say yes or no and watch the world rearrange itself accordingly. Now he knew better. Wealth was this. A child who smiled even when half his face didn't cooperate. A woman who taught you that patience wasn't weakness. A single feeding that took 30 minutes instead of 3, and felt more valuable than any quarterly earnings call. Wealth was the moment you realized you could stop running, and the world wouldn't collapse. Wealth was choosing to stay when everything in you had been trained to leave. Wealth was watching someone care, really care, when you had forgotten it was even possible. And all it had taken to rediscover, that was letting go of everything he thought mattered. Ethan closed his eyes. Somewhere in the city, deals were still being made. Fortunes were still rising and falling by the second. But here, in this quiet room with the sound of Leo's soft breathing drifting down the hall, Ethan Caldwell, the man who once believed time was the only thing he couldn't buy, finally understood. He was rich. Not in billions. In moments he no longer rushed through. And for the first time in decades, that felt like enough. More than enough. It felt like everything.